Okay, well, thank you so much for all of you that are here already for this preparing survey data webinar. Super fun to see a lot of familiar names, old students and friends, and fun to see some new names as well. If this is your first time joining us for the webinar, or you haven't had a class with me before, extra welcome to you. Thanks for joining us for the next half an hour. We're looking forward to it. So before we jump into some technical content, I'm just going to give a quick background about who I am and what am I doing presenting to you today. So if I can get PowerPoint to agree with me. Maybe I can, maybe I can't. There we go. All right. So my name is Eric. I work with an organization called OneNumber. I've been partnering with Tableau and working with their product for 5 years now. So across Tableau, Tableau Prep in the last year, and Alteryx for most of that time as well. I've probably taught around 2,000 students how to prepare and visualize their data across a wide swath of industries. So those are the main kind of a lot of challenges I focus on, is helping people when they run into really complex problems. And my job and my hope is to improve your life in some way. So that could be improving your company, increasing revenue or decreasing costs. It might be helping make a process more efficient for you so that you spend less time doing manual repetitive things, or going the long way around when there's maybe a faster way to solve the data problem. So today's content is really around what the webinar is titled, Preparing Survey Data. And it's a issue that I've run into across a lot of organizations. What you'll typically see is there are a few issues when working with survey data. We'll look at an example here in just a moment, but how it usually works is, right, you have some sort of survey platform, and eventually you either connect directly to a table of data, or you export that data, and then you get all your survey results. And so what happens is, and again, I'm generalizing, but each row of data is a single response to the survey. And then each column is either a piece of demographic information about that respondent, maybe when they took the survey, or what their name is, or their response ID, or it's a question. So how satisfied were you with your purchase? Would you buy from us again? Would you recommend us to a friend? Any comments you have? So what happens is, because the data is structured like that, with each question being its own column, you run into issues with trying to visualize multiple questions at a time. If you're just purely trying to visualize the responses as text, that's maybe a little bit simpler. But when you're getting into more complex types of survey response visuals, having every question be its own column poses a bit of a challenge. And another challenge to that is that usually with surveys, you're going to have multiple response types. What I mean by that is, some questions might be a 1 through 5, some might be a 0 through 10, some might be true false, some might be free-form text responses. So there's a lot of different types of responses you might have as well. So what we're going to do to make it simple today, because we're on a limited budget of time, is we're just going to focus on one possible type of survey response visual. And so it will be this. This is called a 100% stacked bar chart, and it's overlaid with a dual axis showing an average response. So you could see each bar represents a single question. The sections of the bar represent what % of respondents gave a 1 through 5 response to that question. And then that little circle represents what the average response was. Okay, so we're going to talk about how you get your survey data in such a format that you could build something like this. And just as a quick background to that, when your data is in, oh, I might have pulled up the wrong workbook here. All right, well, so be it. All right, it's a little uglier than I hoped, but you know what, that happens. So when your data is in a sort of traditional survey, how would I say this? It's sort of a traditional way that a survey would spit it out. It might look like this, where your dimensions and your measures represent a bunch of questions. And just to show you what this underlying data looks like, it's basically this, right? Much like we talked about, each row is a response. After you get past the demographics, each column is an individual question. So when it's set up like this, what you are able to do is you could visualize like a question at a time. So this would be what percent of respondents said they gave you a 5 on how your communication was rated versus a 1. But it's not easy to show, for instance, all 4 of these questions at once. And this is what the survey data looks like after, or the survey data after it's been spit out by Tableau Prep through the process we're going to talk about, allows you to do what I'm hovering over just now. So you might think, well, okay, you can only look at one question at a time. Well, what if we pivoted it in Tableau Desktop? And depending on the way your survey data is structured, that is a possible solution, but only if each of your questions is the same question type. So if they are all true, false questions, or they are all 1 through 5 questions, what you could do is go back to your data source and then go ahead and select the headers, shift select all those questions, and just do a simple pivot. Okay, so you end up with basically a question field and a response field. Now the issue with the data set I'm working with is that there are multiple response types. So notice that response field, called pivot field values right now, it starts with some yes/no questions, but eventually you get far enough down and you'll see that there's some free-form text, and then eventually there are some numeric responses as well. But this field right now is recognized by Tableau as a string field, which means that it's text. So you can't necessarily create an average or a percent of total based on a string field. So we could change this to be a number field, but then our text responses like yes, no, or free-form responses are invalidated because Tableau can't recognize those alphabetical characters as a numeric response. So that's where you end up kind of running into a stopping point with Tableau Desktop, and maybe you end up turning somewhere else. So maybe you turn to SQL, or maybe you have some other third-party tool. So what I'm going to do is show you, okay, let's take that same data and put it in Tableau Prep so that we can get it, again, in a format so we can do things like this. All right, so we're going to look at actually 10 steps to do that. I am recording this webinar, so if you want to come back through this later and rewatch any of this content or take screenshots, you'll be able to do that. So if any of these sections feel fast, you can always revisit it. At the same time, if you have questions that come up, feel free to toggle with the Go to Webinar menu and type your questions in. I'm not going to answer questions until the end just because I'm bad at multitasking and I won't be able to look at questions while I'm also demonstrating. But I'm happy to revisit any concepts or answer further questions as much as time allows when we're done. So here's our 10 steps. We're going to go ahead and go through these one by one. And let me go ahead and do this. I need to close this Excel file so I can use it in Tableau Prep, otherwise I'll get an error. So we'll go through these. So number 1, load the data into Tableau Prep. I've got Prep already loaded because that sometimes can take a couple minutes just for the software to boot up. So that's done. I'm going to grab my Excel file, drop it into Prep, and let it load. Okay. So here's the response data. You can see all of my different fields here. Looks like everything loaded the way that I would hope. Okay. Step number 2, create one branch, or you can call this one clean tool in Tableau Prep that just houses demographic and filtering data. So what I mean by filtering data is any question that you would want to filter your respondents by. So if you have a question that says, would you ever purchase from us again, yes or no, and you want to be able to filter on the no's and investigate those respondents in more detail, you'd want to include that question in this branch. So I'll go ahead and do that. And I'm just going to give these steps really brief names so that I know what they are in real life. Do a better job at annotating than I do. So, okay, response IDs, names, city, states, I want all of that. And I'm just going to leave all of my yes, no questions as well. I want those to be able to filter on. And let's see if there's anything else I'd want to keep. I think I'm going to remove all of my 0 through 10, 1 through 5, and free-form text questions at this step. You don't have to, but I'm going to do that here. Okay, so that step is done. Okay, next step is to create alternative branches for each question type. So what that means is, as you can see from this visual, I'm going to create one branch for every type of question that I have in my survey responses. And that's going to come directly from that initial first data input step. So add a branch, and I'll start with my yes/no questions. Okay, so really important, when you do this step, you want to make sure that you leave the response ID as well, because eventually we're going to need to tie this back to our initial demographic information, and the response ID is the way that you're going to sort of tie everything back together. Okay. So I'm going to try and do this part somewhat quickly because it can be a little bit time consuming depending on how many different question types you have. So sorry, yes, no's. Maybe next I'll do my 0 through 10 questions. And again, same process here. Okay. If you ever end up making a mistake, if you've used Tableau Prep a little bit, you probably know how to undo a change. But let's say that I accidentally actually removed a question there that I did need after all. You can always come back to your changes pane and actually delete a change that you've made so that like all of those questions, or in this case, columns of data, would come back. Okay, got a couple of free-form text responses, and in this case, it's just filler text because this isn't real data. I can't show you my client's data because then I'd probably get sued. So I don't want that to happen. Okay, and I think I just have one more now, which would be those 1 through 5 responses. Okay, let me just do a quick double check there. Yep, that looks good. Okay, so that step is done. In real life, that might take you a little bit longer as you're sorting through. I set all that data up so that that could happen quickly. Okay, now what I want to do is for each of those branches I just created, I want to create a question type field. So notice here, basically what I'm going to be doing is creating a calculated field that just tells you what type of question it is. So, and once I get the Tableau desktop, I could filter and say, okay, I just want to keep my 1 through 5 questions, and I want to build this 100% stacked bar chart. So that's actually going to be just in these same tools here. Create a calculated field, question type. This will be free form text. And then you may not know this, but when you're working in Tableau Prep, something you can do is you can actually just copy a step from one part of your flow, go to another part of your flow, and paste that step in. So I'm going to go ahead and edit this. So instead of this being free form text, now I'm in my yes, no's. Do that a couple more times here. Okay. Cool. So we are good on that front. Step 5. So now that we've separated the different types of questions out, added this question type field, we need to pivot each of the questions, or the columns of questions, I should say, in each of those branches so that we end up with 2 columns, what's going to be called question and response. So going back here, I'm going to add a pivot to each of these steps. Other than the demographic step, I don't need it there. So in this case, like, okay, let's see, I'm going to wind this out again a little bit. So I'm going to get these two questions I have and drop them both into the pivot values. Response ID and question type can remain independent of that pivot. Okay, same thing here. Just control select all those, put them over there, and a couple more times now. Oops. All right. So you can see a lot of this is just basically building out the same flow for each of your question types. So there's a little bit of repetitive work as you go through this. Okay. So now what I want to do is with those pivots, I want to create a question field. So the text, like, how would you rate our customer service? Like, that becomes a question. And the response is interesting because like we looked at in Tableau Desktop, responses can be tricky when you pivot because we basically have two possible different response types. We have just standard text questions, and then we have responses, which could either, in this case, be text or numeric. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through each of these sections. So like pivot one here. So I can just double click where it says pivot one names and say, yep, this is my question field. And then pivot one values, this is a response, but I want to indicate specifically that it's a text response. So that later, when I bring all this data back together, the text responses and the numeric responses actually are their own unique columns. So yes, no, same kind of thing here. It's going to be question, and once again, this is going to be response text. And it is important to try to make sure that these are the same. So like notice that this response text, I put a space between the two, and then this is actually an accident, but it's a good teaching moment. This one I didn't. That's actually going to give us, it's going to make us have to do a little bit more manual effort later in our union. So better just to try and make those as similar as possible when you can early on. So these didn't all get in there somehow. Okay. So this one's going to be different. Now this is a response, but it's actually going to be a number response, right? I'm going to go ahead and just put a numeric symbol afterwards. And then one more time over here as well. Okay, cool. I think the majority of the painstaking duplicated effort work is now done. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take all of those different branches with the pivoted data, and we're going to go ahead and union them together. So what this looks like, I'll take one pivot, hover over another till I see union, throw that in there. And I want to add each of the other pivots as well. So you don't want to hit union, that's going to create a new union. You just say, hey, add this to the existing union. Okay, so what this looks like is our sort of generic fields like question. There should be a little color band showing that, okay, that shows up for every one of them. Something like response number only exists for a couple of those pivots. And same thing with response text. So that is what we were hoping for, so that looks good. Okay, we're going to join the question branches back to the demographic branch that we built at the very beginning, and we're going to use response ID to do that. The demographic branch, join that over here. Okay, looks like they already matched on response ID. You can always do a quick check at this point to make sure that all of your rows of data from both sections are included. If not, I guess that probably means that you lost some response IDs along the way, so you'll want to go back and double check your work. So that's looking good. And now I need to do a little bit of cleaning and then output what I've built. So what I mean by cleaning is I might have a few repetitive fields now. So I'm going to add a step. Just do a quick look through my fields. One way you can find if you have duplicate fields is when you search here, if you just put in the number 1. Notice like I have a response ID and I have a response ID 1. That's because I joined my response IDs together. So this is a duplicate, and that can just go away in this case. And I think I do have one other that I don't need. I think it's called table names, and that's what is generated by default when I unioned all the different sections together. But I kind of built my own table names field when I created a question type, and that's actually going to be more useful anyways. So what I'm going to do is just say, you know what, don't need table names. Okay, so let me go ahead and output this. Quick browse here. I'll just send it to my desktop so we can knock this out quickly. Survey output, nope, survey, yeah. Okay, everything looks good. I should run my flow. So just small sample data, so shouldn't take very long. And so now what I can do is go ahead and load this up into Tableau Desktop. And I'll just do a quick build of that visual I showed you at the beginning. I don't want to spend a super long time on it because I'd rather have a few extra minutes for questions at the end than just sit here and talk about visualizing data when this is really more about data preparation. But you know what? You came all this way. Let's do it. So here's what my data looks like if I'm looking at it now. So what's happened is actually, originally I had 1,000 rows of data. And what you're going to see now is that I have 13,000 rows of data. So what we've done is we've taken the questions and pivoted it so that like a single respondent has 13 rows now, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do this. I'm going to filter my question type field down to just the 1 through 5 questions, okay? I want to see what those questions are, so I'll put question on rows. I want to know how many responses I had to each of these questions. So I'm going to take response ID to columns and get a count distinct of response ID. A quick way of doing that, right click and drag response ID to columns. Ask for that count distinct. Set my fit to entire view. So, okay, great. I have 1,000 responses to each of these questions. Now I want to see how many people gave this, their answer as a 1, how many gave it as a 5. So I'm going to put my response number on color. So right now it's just showing me like what's the sum of all the responses, I guess. So what I want to do is turn that response number into a discrete field and actually make it a dimension as well. Again. Okay, so what I have now is people that are green gave me a 5, people that are blue gave me a 1. Go ahead and change these colors a little bit. So in this palette. If I want to rearrange this sort order, there are kind of some more systematic ways of doing this, or I can just do this the old school by hand way, just drag my color legend in the order that I want it. Okay, so here's the people that gave me 1s, here's the people that gave me 5s. Now what I'm going to do, get my distinct count of response ID, drag a copy of the label, and I'm going to make this a % of total. Okay, let's do a little bit here to clean this up and make sure it's formatted correctly. Okay, so now I can see, for instance, out of the 1,000 people that said or rated our communication, 19.5% gave us a 1. And I think our original question was to figure out people that heard about us by radio, what did they think? Or at least that was supposed to be our original question if I didn't mention it. Okay, so people that heard about us by radio actually think our communication is worse than the average person. Or no, sorry, they think it's better. They think their overall satisfaction is worse. You can see that's a pretty big section there, 27.5. But they were happy with our communication, I guess. So the last bit to show that average circle on top of this is it's actually a dual axis chart. So again, I'm going to do this part quickly. You can always come back and watch this again if you want to see how all this works. So I'm going to go ahead and put my response number on columns once again. And I'm going to change this one to be an average. I'm going to go down to the second part of my marks card now. And I'm going to remove my response number from color. I'm going to remove this little % thing from text. And change my mark type to be a circle. I'm going to make it bigger, maybe even bigger. I'm going to edit my axis down here so it ranges from 0 to 5. Okay, little bits of formatting at this point. I'm going to go ahead and show my mark label. so I can see what that number is. Center it. Change the formatting so there's 1 decimal. Okay, change the color so this is a little bit more toned down. Edit my label. Oh, I need to do it this way actually. That field on label, then edit. Do something like this. Okay, so my average response is this number. Now what I want to do is to overlay these two on top of each other. So I'm going to right click on my second pill and say, give me a dual axis. Everything gets all jacked up for a second. I need to set my original chart type back to a bar. And my new chart type's that circle. I need to sort of size it correctly. And it doesn't look as good in this case because the numbers are sort of overlapping each other. I may hide this header. So this may take a little bit of kind of configuring to sort this out exactly the way that I want it to look. But in the big picture, that is how you create that visual. So all of this was made possible because I set the data up the way that I did in Tableau Prep. There are certainly other ways, depending on your data, that you may need to prepare it, but that's sort of a good general overview for your standard survey responses and how you could set it up. And if I hadn't done it this way, we'd either have to create each of these 4 sections as 4 separate worksheets, or potentially do a bunch of extra wrangling in Tableau Desktop that might end up being painful and may or may not actually end up even working. So that's mainly what I wanted to show you. We do have a couple of minutes left until 9:30, so I'd love to take some questions if anybody has any that pop up. So I'm going to go ahead and just give a little bit of space now for those questions. And while you are typing those out in the questions dialog, I just wanted to speak to, like, what do you do now? Well, try this. Happy to answer immediate questions. And if you have some bigger picture questions or you want a little bit more hands-on help doing this with your own data, feel free to reach out to me when I send the follow-up content. I've got what are called office hours where you could just reserve an hour of time with me at a time. And I'm always happy to spend some time working with you there. So like I said, I'm going to give you a little bit of time now to type out those questions if you have any. All right, I see a hand, but I'm not seeing a question. So let me see, Brian, I'm going to try and unmute you to see if this works. Oh, I see a question now. Nope. Okay, I'm going to unmute you here, Brian. All right. Maybe it was an accidental hand raise, but did you want to ask a question?
Well, yes. Can you hear me?
Yep, can hear you okay.
Okay. Well, pardon me. Currently, we use a Qualtrics system. I was going to try to take that out, but I had multiple windows open. We use a Qualtrics system right now that houses our survey. And these surveys actually go out to our clients based upon the settings or conditions that we've set there. Now, I'm not the originator of it. I kind of maintain it by just updating a few things to send it out to our clients. But I'm not really sure. I don't have a Tableau strength at this time, so I'm not really sure how we would transfer from Qualtrics to Tableau Prep or to present this kind of information. So I might need some more technical help to understand how that works. Are you still there?
Oh, sorry, still here. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and mute you, Brian, while I give the responses because there's a little bit of feedback. So that's a great question, which is, yeah, what happens if you maybe don't have total control over your end data? And so I've worked with Qualtrics a little bit. It's not, by any means exclusively what I've worked with. What I'm going to guess is that there is either a way with Qualtrics to download the data into maybe a CSV or an Excel file, or potentially even to connect directly to the data table if you store it on site, or there might be a cloud data table. And Tableau Prep, the way that it's set up now is that when you have a Tableau desktop license, you actually get the Prep license with it. That's kind of part of Tableau's new monthly subscription service. So for those of you that are like, do I have Tableau Prep? Do I not? Would definitely recommend checking with your sort of whoever oversees Tableau at your organization to see if you can get a license key for Tableau Prep as well, because it's very likely that it may be something you have already that you just don't even know that you have. And I did just get a response, which is that Qualtrics has a new integration with Tableau as an added cost. Good to know. I haven't had a chance to look at that in a lot of detail yet, but that might be worth looking into as well. So I've got another question here. I'm going to try and knock this out. It says, we'd love to know how to deal with fields that the user can multi-select, like red, yellow, or green, that are in the same field. I have a number of fields like this, and I also need to be able to filter on them. It's a great question. So sometimes the way that survey data is set up is such that, think about how to word this. Yeah, like a response might have commas in it. So let's say there's a question like, which of our services have you used in the last month? And you can multi-select, and then the way that the answer is given is like, okay, let's use GoToWebinar as an example. So I've used GoToWebinar, comma, GoToMeeting, comma, go to whatever else. Okay, so you have 3 responses all separated by commas. I won't be able to show an example just now, but essentially what you would want to do with that is you would take that response, split it based on the commas, so that each of the responses, there'd be like, okay, people that responded, you know, response 1, response 2, response 3. And you'd eventually take that data and pivot it. That would add a little bit more complexity to the approach that I showed in this example, because I didn't have any data in this example structured like that. If I can find an example of that in online literature, I'm happy to speak to that. What I may actually do as well is just jot that down and try and do a future blog post about it, because I think it's a great question. And I do know that the Tableau Prep class that Tableau offers does have some examples that go through that. So maybe a chance to practice that if that's something that you're interested in at all. You could look toward that. All right. Yeah, so it's got a question. Will there be a way to view this presentation again at a later date, share with my colleagues? Yeah, so this is being recorded. I'll try and have it up as soon as possible and get an email out with the recording. I'll have the video up on Vimeo as you know in the next couple of days, so that you can come back and revisit this and to share it with others. Yeah. Okay. Well, we ran a little bit over. I know some of you had to leave. Thanks for all the nice comments for those that are taking off and have to leave. Really appreciate it. For those that are watching the recording, if you're like, how do I get in touch with these people? Here is my email address. It's eric.parker@onenumber.biz. So that's actually great for you that are here in person as well. You're welcome to respond, ask questions, give feedback there. Or again, if you're watching on the recording, you can reach me there. So yeah, thank you so much, everybody, for joining for this. Really appreciate you being here on a Friday morning, and look forward to staying in touch. Take care.